nice to see you all. Thank you for being here with us. And sorry we had to split up into two groups, but we were managing traffic and all the things. Today, I'm pretty sure, has been full moon or something, that like everybody with a sick kid, flat tire, odd traffic. It has just been that kind of morning, but we're so happy to see so many people who came out to visit with us today. I'm going to introduce Elaine Copper. She's our Deputy Superintendent for Finance and Operations, and she's excited to talk to you a little bit about taxes in our school district. Hand it over to her.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Here. Other than school finance, my second favorite topic, debt and taxes. Not really.
Perfect.
So I also have with us this morning Dan Wegmiller. He's our financial advisor when it comes to debt issuance. So all the hard questions are going to be directed to him this morning. Thank you, Dan, for agreeing to do that. So let's dive in real quickly at what we're going to talk about this morning. So first of all, again, talk about the tax rate, and it's split up in two components. Why does a school district have debt? Examine our debt compared to other fast growth school districts, and then learn how our district's debt is financed. And I'm actually going to come over here so I don't have to keep turning. No, you're good. You're going to get a neck cramp. All right, so let's start with property taxes. Can everyone hear? And if you're standing in the back, there's some chairs up here if you want to come up front. All right, so in Texas, property taxes are the way that schools, fire departments, all city things are funded. So Texas does not have a state income tax, and therefore property taxes are our largest source of money. Like I said, to pay for schools, streets, roads, etc. How many people were at the Taxpayer Tuesday last month? In the middle of the month? Okay, good. So you have a little bit of a foundation. We talked about how school finance actually works. Texas law then establishes the process by which property values and taxes are set. So understand that there are appraisal districts in nearly every county across the state. They set the local property value, but then the comptroller comes in and reviews those values to make sure that the local appraiser is appraising properly. So many years ago here in Dripping Springs, the Hays County Appraisal District was not setting values appropriately, and the district went into what was called grace. You get 2 years of grace, and then the state says your local values aren't right. We're going to give you state values. This is what we think your value should be. Why is that important? If we get state values are used a lot in our funding formulas. That's what the state thinks we're collecting taxes on. So if our state values are higher than our local values, we're paying recapture on values that tax collections that we're not really getting. So just last week, we received our state values for 2022. And again, Hays County was found to not be valid. So we're back in a year of grace, which means first year of grace, we get our local values. But now this is another job for me to go work with our appraiser and find out why our values aren't where the state says they need to be. So the Texas law establishes checks and balances, not only in the way property is appraised, but also in setting tax rates. So we have a lot of rules that we follow in how we set the tax rate and collect taxes.
Is the state taking into account homestead exemptions as part of their?
They do, but they do some things differently than local. You have a 5% variance, so the local can be 5% lower or 5% higher. Right now we're at 90%, so we are way outside of the range.
What year was that consideration?
That's for 2022.
2022 certified values. So does that err on the high side or the low side? The state is saying our values are higher?
The state is saying our values are higher than what they are. Our local values are 90% of what the state says.
Just real quick, because this is an important point, are we getting punished via the mechanism of recapture for not having collected as much tax locally?
We would be if we were assigned state value. We would be penalized because the state would think we're collecting taxes on those higher values, meaning we would pay.
Well, why don't they look at the reality of the actual number of dollars that we're collecting? collected rather than the theoretical.
Just the way it works.
Do you have the ability to go back and reclaim any of that delta between what the state?
We have the ability to file an appeal and say that the state numbers are wrong, but when you're 10% outside of what the state says, because the local values are at 90% of what the state says they should be, you're not going to find enough errors. And so that's why they give you 2 years of grace. So they give the appraisal district a couple of years to get things right before you get penalized with those state values.
And that's really the argument between the appraisal district and the state.
Yes,
We're
but
having
that is the mechanism for the state to make sure that local appraisers are doing their job, because what could happen is the appraisers and the school district say, you know what, keep our values low, we'll get more money from the state, we'll keep property taxes low, and so if the appraiser did that, then the state is paying more of the share of education. The state doesn't want to do that, so that's why they do this comptroller study to say, hey, is the local appraiser doing their job?
And everything revolves around that percentage that is charged to that value. So if value indirectly is different, our percentages of how much we draw from that taxable rate can be pulled down and get the state back in line with that. Yes, my value of my house is not true, but if you're not taking, 0.34%, you're taking 0.26%. But then we hit the floor on what the taxable minimum would be, right? Because
Yeah,
we're going
so-
beyond the exceeding point.
So I don't really want to go down this rabbit hole,
Yeah.
just to say that there are
That rabbit hole.
mechanisms where the state makes sure that we're not gaming the system, either through values or setting a tax rate too low. There are checks and balances, which is the point to this whole thing. So when it comes to property taxes, of course, there are exemptions. So property owners, first of all, you're required to apply for this exemption, and that application date is May 1. But you get a homestead exemption on your residence. You have to own and occupy the home as your residence. You can have it apply for the entire year, or it's prorated, depending on the type of exemption. Generally, you can't have a homestead exemption on 2 properties. So if you have 2 properties, one's your homestead, the other may be a rental, you don't get that same exemption on that second property. And then back in May, voters approved raising that homestead exemption for school taxes to $40,000. This is one thing that they'll potentially be looking at in this legislative session to pass on more tax relief. I've heard numbers as high as $70,000 as a homestead exemption. We'll have to see what happens with this session. Then, if you qualify as a person age 65 or older or disabled, school districts are required to give you another $10,000 homestead exemption. This applies as of January 1 in the year that you become 65 or disabled. You can't have both. So if you are disabled and 65, you choose which one. You only get one. And if you are a disabled vet, you may be exempt from taxation in total. And again, you have to apply for these. So the appraisal district doesn't keep track of everybody's birthday. You have to make sure that you notify them of this status. Then a further benefit of being age 65 or disabled when it comes to taxes is for school taxes, your taxes are frozen. So not your value, but the amount that you pay. And the ceiling, we call that a tax ceiling, so that's the most you're gonna pay on that homestead. It's the year that you turn 65 or disabled, and then if the calculated taxes in any year fall below that frozen levy, you pay the lesser. So if you remember voting last May, there were 2 elections. The second one was fixing the frozen levy for persons that were frozen at a higher tax rate after school districts started lowering their tax rate in 2019. So it's important that you also file to get your taxes frozen. So let's switch gears and talk about school district taxes in particular. So our total tax rate is split into 2 buckets, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. The largest portion of our tax rate is for the operations, and that's what we call M&O, and then the other part is called interest and sinking. If you were with us in January, we talked about the MCR, the maximum compressed rate. After House Bill 3 in 2019, the Texas Education Agency got involved in the calculation of our tax rates, and they now certify what this MCR will be based on the property value growth in your district. On top of that MCR, so you have the MCR, that's the max that the district can tax. On top of that, the board can authorize 5 golden pennies without voter approval. Voters can authorize 3 additional golden pennies on top of that for a total of 8 golden. And voters can authorize up to 9 copper pennies. In 2016, Dripping Springs went to the voters and asked to lower the INS rate and increase the M&O rate through a TRE, and the voters approved that. So in 2016, we had all of the golden pennies and all of the copper pennies through voter approval. And then that second portion of the tax rate, the INS, the board authorizes that up to 50 cents for what is necessary to pay debt. So when we go out for a bond election, the language says authorize a tax rate to support those bonds, and then we calculate what that tax rate will be needed to service those bonds. But at the state maximum, it's 50 cents. So you can't have an INS rate of more than 50 cents.
I think you did mention this before. The MCR applies only to the M&O portion, and that has nothing to do with INS.
Absolutely. You are a good student, Tony. All right, so looking at this visually, the green bucket, that maintenance and operations. So this is like your household budget. This is where we pay salaries for all employees. This is where we pay for supplies, transportation, utilities, everything that goes into running the school. So everything that you see in this room, the books, the lights, the heat, the people, all of that is paid out of this green maintenance and operations bucket. The INS bucket, which is for debt service, the only thing you can do with those tax collections is pay principal and interest on bonds that have been approved previously. So every district that I'm in, this is my 8th district across the state, when we go out for a bond election, people always say, well, don't build schools, just use those bonds to pay people more. We want to pay teachers more. You cannot use bond money for that. The INS is like your mortgage payment. You don't go to the bank and get a mortgage to buy groceries. You go get a mortgage to pay for your house. And so it's the same thing for the school district. So when we look at the components, because there's a lot of them, and I used to always say I would never talk to the board or the public about golden or copper pennies, because that was too in the weeds, and now here I am having to talk about different colored pennies. So that MCR, this is level 1, this is the maximum compressed tax rate. Again, TEA tells us what that rate is. If we don't tax at that rate, we don't get our full basic allotment, so we pay more recapture. So again, that check and balance, the state doesn't want us gaming the system. These tier 1 pennies are subject to recapture.
Again, I would like to stress something that came up in the last presentation. That maximum tax rate should really be called a minimum tax rate, the way you just pointed out, correct?
It's a minimum, but it's also a maximum. So we have to tax at that, but we can't tax more. So it's the just right tax rate.
Well, to me, it's a little deceptive to use the word maximum. I'm not accusing you.
Well, that's the law.
but
That's the law, so that's why I refer to it that way. Because all of the correspondence will say your MCR, your maximum compressed. When I am governor, I will fix all of this.
If you expand, just for 2 seconds, expand the concept behind it being minimum again, you explained it very well
Because-
last time.
Well, I don't think you explained it well last time because you went into the detail of why, they're imposing that upon this ISD, that you have to tax at that rate. So to me, that's a minimum. It's not, to say that it's a maximum, it sounds like, well, you have the option to tax less, but you don't really.
You don't. And that is the misnomer. In the state's eyes, that's the maximum we can have on that portion. But also, what they don't say is, well, if you have less than that, you're gonna get penalized, because you have to dig deep to find out that information. Because I asked, I said, well, wait, so if I lower this, can I get less recapture? And the answer is no, because if you lower that, you get penalized on that basic allotment, so.
It's like being between the floor and the ceiling.
It's
with
the
about a
floor and
half
the
an inch.
ceiling, it's just, it's there. We are at the floor, so there's also a floor on where that maximum rate can drop below, because the state, when that MCR goes down, the state is picking up more of the share. So we should really be at 70-something cents, we're at 80.46. But there's a floor that you can't go below. And so that's another thing that the legislature will be looking at this session, lowering that floor.
A statewide floor that.
There's a statewide floor. So if you'll recall, last month I showed you a map of the state of how many people, how many districts were at the floor in one year and how many are at this year. I think it was like 90% of school districts are at that floor. So it's got to be lowered again. We just don't know what it'll be lowered to. Then in the second tier, so there's 2 tiers within M&O, so this is where it gets real complicated. You can't just have 1 tier, you have to have 2. This is where those special pennies come in. So these 8 golden pennies, there is no recapture. And there's no lid on how much you can earn. That's why they're golden. Because if you don't earn your entitlement through your tax collections, the state will fund you. But if you earn more than your entitlement, they don't take it back. So those golden pennies are truly golden. The copper, those 9 that are available, those are subject to recapture. And so there is a lid on how much you can collect there. And this was all discussed last month.
So these are pennies that go to our tax rate. That we
They go
sell.
on our tax rate.
Do we, the taxpayers, have a breakdown of these various pennies? Or?
I have one for you in just a minute. And then the INS, we did not talk about the INS rate last time. That is the one that the board sets to pay voter-approved debt, and there is no recapture. So in high recapture districts, you're trying to maximize these pennies by putting things like portables, facility repairs on that side of the bucket because you're not paying recapture. So we're going to focus more on what happens with these tax collections today.
Excuse me, you just mentioned prioritizing putting facilities in Illinois. I was under the impression facilities have to be funded.
No, so INS,
I'm
so
sorry.
INS, remember we can only pay for
I
debt.
had it backwards.
So if we put our maintenance on the debt side, we get the full benefit of those pennies. So you asked about a breakdown of our tax rate. So here's our tax rate. Our total tax rate is $1.2929. The first part of that is that MCR. That's the first calculation. What is your maximum compressed rate? For Dripping Springs, it's 80.46. That happens to be the floor across the state, and the majority of school districts are at this floor because what happened this past summer, this past 22, property values all across the state shot up. That caused all school districts to lower their tax rate on the MCR side. And so the state max for us and the floor is 8.46. That's where we're at. Then we have those golden pennies, remember? So you have 8 available. The voters approved these back in 2016. We still have them. That's the max we can have. And they have not been affected by changes in state law. The copper pennies, we have 5.83. We can have up to 9. We would have had the 9 before House Bill 3, but because of tax compression, they've been pushed down to 5.83. Could I go back and ask for more of these? I could, but it would be a hard sell because I pay so much recapture on those, so I wouldn't come to you asking for those pennies unless we were in dire straits. Then you add the INS rate for the total. So when you add our MCR, our golden, and our copper, That's our M&O, so that's 94 something, 29 cents. So that's what runs the school district. Then we add the 35 cents for debt service to get to our total of $1.29. The state says the max we can tax over here is 50 cents. So by law, we could have a rate up to $1.47, but the board would have to increase this 35, and we would have to go to the voters for those additional copper. So you're all going to be experts on MCRs and local things. All right, so let's look at the history of the tax rate in Dripping Springs ISD. Back in 2005, the maximum M&O rate was $1.50 across the state. I kind of remember those years, it was a long time ago. A lot of districts were at $1.50, and then the law changed, and you can see that the tax rate went down. Tax rate changed again in '07, and we were reduced to $1.04, and that's because nearly every district was at $1.50, and the question became, is this now a statewide tax, which is illegal? And so the law changed, and then it pushed us all down to 104. We stayed there until 2016, went to the voters, said we want to lower the INS and put more money for operations because we needed it for operations. The voters approved that, and the M&O rate went to $1.17. It stayed there for 3 years, and in 2019, what happened? No, right before pandemic. House Bill 3. So they completely turned school finance on its head and said, we're going to start lowering your tax rate based on property values, and you're only going to get additional revenue on about 2.5%. So the tax rate started going down, and it's continued to go down to where it is 94.29. That 94.29, remember, is the MCR and the golden and the copper pennies. So since 2016, the tax rate has come down, actually since 2019, almost 23 cents. The M&O portion is the lowest that it's been since the 1980s. So I found a file with all of our records, and it was in the 80s that we had a higher or a lower tax rate.
In 2016, when the voters voted to move that, you're talking about the copper pennies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the voters vote for an increase for the copper pennies. Does that become perpetual from that moment on?
It does. The only reason that it's changed is because the law changed, and those copper pennies have been compressed to where they are today.
I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to correlate that with the annual budget in terms of a per student, like a sidebar between those two. So I love data, and I want to see if there's a way that actually tells the story about that this is going down and we are increasing our student population, our budget line stays, flat to fair.
Now, our budget line doesn't stay flat.
Well,
because
from
we're
a total
students.
cost, it is, but
Yes. And I'm
as
sure
you're
we have that
increasing your
data.
student capacity, does that story come out and you overlay both of those graphs together?
That would be an interesting exercise. But here you can see where we were at 48 cents, 2016. So while we increased here, we lowered here to 35 cents. And so that's where INS has been since 2016. There have been two significant things. We had the 2014 bond election, we had the 2018 bond election. Typically what happens when you issue new bonds, you need to raise that INS rate to service those bonds. We've not had to do that because property value growth has supported those bonds, and as we were projecting last fall, would have supported new bonds. So the 35 cents hasn't changed and won't change unless we pay off all of our debt and then we're issuing another bond, and then it would go down. All right, so all of this is just a bunch of numbers, right? So I said, well, let's take some actual property tax bills for people in our district and see what's really going on. So this is a house.
Could I just say, I'm sorry to do this, but this is a big sticking point. You just mentioned that that 35 cents would not go down unless the debt was paid off. Well, you know, there's phenomenal growth in the area. There's the growing number of properties being taxed, and property values are going up, so there's more revenue coming in. So it's not that, I mean, assuming there's no new bonds, the debt payments each year is made relatively static, but there's this windfall of new money coming in from new properties and higher values, so that rate should be coming down.
It should come down if we weren't going to build additional schools or when we pay off all our debt.
And that's why I maintain that these bonds, despite the messaging out there, they do represent a tax increase because we would be paying a greater number of dollars than we otherwise would have. Now, I'm not saying that we can get anything for free. I'm not suggesting that. It's just that the messaging is really bad. When all the messaging out there says, it insinuates that your tax bill will go up. Because that messaging keeps going up. There's no new rate increase, no new rate increase. But our tax bills will go up. Any dollar that's spent is a dollar that needs to be collected from taxpayers. So that's my big complaint is about that particular messaging. And incidentally, that VDE, voter information document, or VID, that the state mandates, that was a complete and total fraud. The bottom line on all three of those documents for the three propositions say zero, literally zero impact on your property tax bill. That is a complete and total fraud. That's a lie. And I'm not blaming you for that. I'm just saying that.
Thank you, because I don't like the law.
No,
You
I'm
know, the
not.
document that he's referring to, though, you
I don't
read
have
it. And the problem is it does, it literally translates to $0, but what it's doing is it's taking the tax rate per dollar. So if you're at 32 cents and the tax rate stays at 32 cents, it literally shows you $0, which of course isn't accurate, but technically it's correct based on what that exercise is doing.
I don't know what to say to that.
I just want to
The way
mention,
that-
we've got a lot of people writing down questions, and she's
Yeah.
got a lot more slides,
I have
and we've got
about
people
2
who are going to need to leave at 11. So I want to
You're
keep
bringing
us
in lunch,
also
right?
on the
I
topic.
might.
And just not
And
give us,
margaritas.
for those who are going to write down questions, make sure that we're.
Okay, so let's go through some real life examples. This is about a 300, can you buy a $30,000 house?
Tiny home.
Not even a tiny home, no, it's expensive. So this current tax year, 2022, here's our tax rate. So here's the rate since 2018, so $1.52, and then see, we started lowering the tax rate. So this is the reduction in the tax rate since 2018. Then the exemptions, so anyone want to tell me why this jumped from 25 to 50? That's the homestead, to 40. So something else happened, right? Either this person hit their 65 or became disabled because the additional 10,000 kicked in as well. Here's what taxable value is done. It was $243,018. Here's the increase in value, taxable value. So remember, your appraised value is going to be higher than your taxable. There's a limit of a 10% increase in taxable value each year. That might be another thing they look at. Here's the taxes, school taxes only. So I don't care what haze in the muds, that's not my responsibility. School taxes in 2018 were 3.7, now they're 3,008, so here's the percentage. So since 2018, this house is paying $178 a year more. We go through this same exercise. Here's a $500,000 house. So the only thing that happened here was the exemption from the state. Same tax rate changes. Their taxable value has increased a little bit differently than the other house. $6,555 in 2018, $6,672. So since 2018, $117 a year more in taxes. Here's a $700,000 house. This one has a lot of stuff going on. So 2018, there's no homestead exemption. Two possible reasons. Y'all are a smart group, tell me what happened.
They moved in.
New construction,
It was a rental.
rental, they just moved in, so taxes are paid here. I'm thinking it's a new construction because this value jumped, right? So the first year, second year, you get the homestead exemption. Then what happened in 2021? Probably hit 65, right? Because look, now their taxes are frozen, so even though the taxable value increased, these taxes are frozen. So yes, this looks like a big increase, but that's not a really good comparison because it was under construction, it wasn't an exemption. I would be interested to see on this property, because the tax rate is going down, and if I was a betting person, I would bet that the tax rate goes down for '23 based on legislative action. I would want to see if the tax calculation for next year is 8,300, is that frozen reduced? Because I think it should be. And then finally, one more example. This is plain cookie cutter, probably more representative of what's happening in the district. You see taxable value growth. You see increases in taxes each year. 2019, most people saw a big reduction in 19 and 20 because that's when we had the most compression on our tax rate. So $793 in 5 years. It's not horrible, it's not great, I wish it was going down. So let's look at our debt. So,
I'm sorry to interrupt, a real crucial point here. A lot of us know, I mean, we all know property values have increased astronomically in our area. And anyone who's lived here long enough, you've had your homestead exemption cap that you mentioned earlier, the 10% per year. In my own particular case, my assessed value for property taxes is this amount. My real value is way up here. The way I interpret this is I have a built-in 10% increase every year until that roughly catches up. I'm estimating at least 5 years for me. And if you compound that, that's a 62% tax increase for me, and probably a whole lot of you. So I want to put that.
and that's why our rate is required to compress and go down, because we're held to, we don't get the benefit of that growth. That's why our rates are compressing. Our rate should have compressed more, but we had that floor. And so this is, I need your help. I need you going to the Capitol and fixing this, because I'm just having to monitor it and maintain it. It's a broken system because we rely so heavily on property taxes. We, as a school district, don't have a lot of flexibility on the operation side. If you look at our basic allotment of 6160 and put it in inflation, we're really only getting over 5,000 a kid every year. Our costs, as you all know, have gone up. So I can go to the Capitol and they look at me and, oh, you're a whiny school person, they have a name for us. You can go as a taxpayer and be heard.
Are there
Real
specific
quickly,
bills?
guys, we're at 11 o'clock, which was our stopping time, and I know some of you may need to leave, so I want to check real quickly. If you need to leave at 11 o'clock, I want to get those questions real quickly, and then we actually need to walk you out because we are on an active campus and walk anybody out who needs to leave. So just real quick show of hands, is there anybody who had a hard stop at 11 and needed to leave now at this time? Okay. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask before you go? Okay, so,
Oh, actually,
Yes.
will we be able to watch the rest of this
Yes.
meeting? It will be at
anybody else have a hard stop at 11 that needs to head out? We just want to make sure that we honor your time, and I know there was traffic and started this late, but I just want to make sure that we take care of everybody who came in good faith.
The rest of us will be online, right?
Yes. Do you have any questions before you head out? Okay, great.
Any specific bills that have been introduced in this session to address this specific issue or along these lines that you know of?
Yes, and going blank on the details. I know they're looking at more compression. I don't know what they're doing on property tax because they just said we're going to put $15 million towards tax relief. I don't know if that's going to come in the form that it has in the past of more compression and more homestead exemption. I talked to the comptroller himself. It doesn't sound like rebates are an option. So will they raise, how much? Will they raise that 10% to where that goes away and you can't be, your taxes can't increase more? I don't know. They haven't worked out those details. And it's early. I mean, it's not until April that they really get serious about these bills, from my experience in all these sessions. So whatever's been filed now is just kind of a complete conversation. There'll be a lot of backroom deals that happen before we know the truth. So the rest of this is going to be a lot of data, a lot of charts. This information was provided by an outside entity comparing school district data across the state. And so I wanted to show you how we as a school district compare to other districts across the state. And so I'm going to try to go through this real quickly, but again, first, why do we issue debt? So the number one reason is to build new facilities. How many of you can go write a check for a new house? So if you raise your hand, I'm going to ask you if you have a single brother. I can't write a check for a new house. As a school district, I can't write a check out of my operations budget for a new school. They are very expensive, and so we ask voters for bonds to build new schools. We have aging facilities. If you've had a house for 20 years, you probably had to do something with your HVAC or your appliances or your plumbing. We renovate older facilities. We acquire assets like land, vehicles, technology, equipment, and then other costs that qualify in a bond that are just out of reach in our operating budget. So that's why we issue debt. How do we pay for it? Well, there's really two ways. You levy a debt tax rate, the INS, or you get state assistance. We do not qualify, but there are these programs. So again, the first thing is levy a tax rate to pay for debt. Then we have what is called the Bond Guarantee Program. There's a lot of news about this right now. This is where the state guarantees bonds for school districts, which gives us a AAA rating, which makes us highly attractive debt for investors. The problem with this right now is it's reached capacity at the IRS level, and so the state is not able to say that they will back school district bonds at this time. What does that mean for us? We have a really strong financial rating on our own. So it means if we were to go sell bonds today, we might pay 10 or 15 basis points more. There's been a lot of articles in the last month or so about the impact of school districts. There was one last night about Fitch, and they're not saying it's a big impact, but it is something that we like to have. That's not really paying our debt, that's just saying if for some reason Dripping Springs evaporated, the state would pay all of our outstanding bonds. The existing debt allotment, this is actual state assistance, and it provides a guaranteed yield on that tax rate, that INS tax rate. We already generate our guaranteed yield, so we don't qualify for EDA. Then there is IFA, instructional facilities. This too helps school district make debt payments on their qualified bonds. So yes, our bonds qualify, but because we're wealthy, the state says we don't need assistance making our payments, so we don't get that either. Then there is new instructional facilities allotment, NIFA, and this is money that we do get, but it's for paper, pencils, it's stuff to open a new school. So when we open a new school, we don't want to put paper, books, supplies for the classroom in a bond. These are the dollars that help us stock a school. And so that's just money that's funneled through the basic allotment. There is an application system, and they don't fully fund this at the state level, so we never get what we think we're going to get because they don't have enough money to fund all the districts.
Is it only for new facilities?
Only for new facilities. So the first year that it's open, based on the ADA, and then the second year, any increase in the ADA, you get a little bit more in that second year. It's just 2 years, and it has to be a new facility. So when we start looking at the data, I've got a lot of charts, so don't get lost in this one, but some of the highlights. So there's about 1,019 school districts in the state. About 85 of those are considered fast growth, meaning when you line up all the districts that grow by a certain percentage, about 85 are considered fast growth. Of those 85, Dripping Springs ISD has the 48th largest student enrollment, so kind of right there in the middle, some larger, some smaller. Our bond principal outstanding ranks 54th out of 85. Our bond principal per student is $32,923, and these are all based on 21-22 data. So we were 39th, the median is just over 30,000. Our debt burden is 3.37. That ranks 62nd as a percentage of taxable value. And our INS tax rate of 35 cents is, the median is 38.42. So we're right there at the median. So I think it's always important to talk about student growth because student growth drives the need for facilities. Yes.
When you mentioned 39th out of how many schools?
Those 85.
85?
Those 85. All right, so why do we build new schools? Just because Clint is bored and needs something to do? No, we build new schools because we have additional students that don't fit in the existing schools. So let's step back and look at our enrollment. So going back to 08-09, just over 4,000 students. So last year at 8,000, we doubled our population. So this year, our official enrollment was 8,375. We continue to grow. In January, we're over 8,400. So you can see the district has been on a trajectory of growth, which is driving the need for facilities. When you look at it another way, let's look at it by our population. So the red is the high school population. So you can see we had a big grade level here, and then it kind of tapers off. Blue is elementary. Elementary really shot up after the pandemic. So we actually lost elementary students during the pandemic because didn't want to send our kids to school, rightfully so. Then shot up and continues to shoot up. Why is it important to look at elementary growth? It's the future, right? So we have, I wrote this down, we have 660 first graders, we have 614 exiting seniors. So the grade levels coming up are starting to be larger than the grade levels that are exiting. So that means it's not just we need facilities today, we're going to need facilities for a while. All right, so this is where we start getting into the data, and this can get really overwhelming, so I try to make really good notes to explain these charts. And I usually don't depend on notes, but in this case I'm going to. So this is looking at all school districts in Texas with an enrollment between 5,000 and 20,000 students who had 50% growth in the last 10 years. So these are districts across the state that look the most like us. Now they're not going to look exactly like us as far as their students. They might have more economically disadvantaged or more bilingual. That's going to be a completely different subset. This is just looking at enrollment. This is going to be the same group that we're looking at throughout everything. I want to point out, don't get lost in Hallsville. Their growth looks exponential, and then you're going to see they have little debt. They have a virtual school program that caused their enrollment to skyrocket. So it's not kids in buildings, it's enrollment for virtual. So they're an outlier. So here's Dripping Springs. In this group, this is based on 21-22. So we were right in the middle as far as student enrollment. This is just our enrollment. So we were at that 8,001. So you can see about half of the districts had smaller enrollment, about half had more. Then, in this same series, we're going to look at Central Texas school districts. So this range is a little bit different. These are school districts in our area that have 6,000 to 27,500 students that have experienced growth over the last 10 years. So in this comparison, yes, we're smaller than our districts in this area that have had growth. So my previous district is not on here because they have more than 27,000 students, but they were fast growth as well. So this just gives you a little bit different perspective. Statewide, as far as the size of district, we're right in the middle. But in our area, there's a lot of fast growth school districts, and we're on the smaller side as far as enrollment.
All over 50% growth as well?
I believe, I don't know if it's 50, it's just with growth in central Texas.
I don't see the annual.
That's because they're over 27,500. And so remember, we're just looking at smaller
Is this
districts.
all the schools or just high school we're talking?
This is the entire district enrollment. Has nothing to do with high schools. Okay, then we're going to look at enrollment growth. So this is how many students did you grow? Comparing to that same state grouping, and see, this is where Hallsville looks like something crazy is going on. It's that virtual. So we grew by 3,400 students, pretty much in the middle of the road across the state. And then in our region, again, just up to 27,500, Kamal grew the most, Hayes, Liberty Hill, Lake Travis, Bernie, and then us. And this is just on pure numbers. When we look at percentages then, so this is percentage growth, we're at 74% growth, so across the state, kind of in the middle. But in our area, Liberty Hill is the only one ahead of us as far as the percentage of our student population. So then behind us, Hutto, Kamal. So remember, Kamal was highest as far as number of students, but as a percentage below us. All right, so that's enrollment. So that gives you an idea of how we compare enrollment-wise. Now let's look at property values. Why would we want to look at property values? Remember, property values are going to have an impact on how much revenue our tax rate brings in. So if you're a little bitty district with really high property values, and you're going to see one of those, your tax rate brings in $4. So it's a simple 50-cent tax rate on 100 million of value is going to be completely different than 10 million of value. So when we look at that same comparison group, remember 5,000 to 20,000 students across the state, our taxable value ranks fourth behind Lake Travis, Barbers Hill, and Bernie. Barbers Hill is one in the Houston area, so they must have a lot of mineral wealth. So our taxable value is on the high side across the state comparison. But when you look in our area, we're back in the middle. Lake Travis, Eames, Pflugerville, Kamal, all above us. Hayes, Georgetown, all above us.
Well, that's the gross value
That's-
for each of these individual.
Yes.
The
This is
potential,
their-
but not the drop, right?
This is just their taxable value.
Okay.
In one big.
Because it's not, that
One-
doesn't take into account what, like, each of these districts has a different M&O.
Right, and
that
we're
they're
looking at
going
that.
after.
They
You're
have
just saying,
different-
this is the bucket that they could be drawing from.
That's the bucket that they're taxing on.
Yeah, all right.
So all of these ahead of us, Eames, Lake Travis, have higher taxable values. Eames, 19.258, us 7, so almost 3 times. Here's locally, wait, I'm sorry. No, this is the growth. So this is the value growth in the last 5 years. Statewide, Barbers Hill, Lake Travis, then us. So this is how much has your values grown in the last 5 years. So comparing to the state, we're in the top 3. Comparing locally, we're back in the middle. So Mal, Pflugerville, Georgetown have had lots of growth in the last 5 years.
I'm not quite sure I understand the point. I mean, I understand the point of looking at average taxable value per homestead or per home or per property. But I don't understand that, well, what's the point of grouping these large buckets? Because different areas are different sizes, and, you know, just because they have a larger gross tax value like that, it could just be a much larger area and has nothing to do with the average property value.
It has to do with how much a penny on their tax rate raises versus ours, because they have higher taxable values.
But part of it depends on whether that higher value is due to a larger number of properties on which people are paying their tax on, therefore a higher student population versus, you know, a smaller number of homes that have very, very high values and a lower student population. So that's why I think it's more valid to look at, you know, the average property value per.
What you're missing on that graph is taxable value and then student count. So taxable value.
Well, we just looked at
versus fringe.
student count.
So overlay both of those, and what you're saying is that small ISD has somewhere in the range of 20,000 students. We have 8,000 students. So all of a sudden, you can see where those numbers now shift back to their taxable value is here. We are 50% of that because we have half that, so then our taxable value starts to normalize into this graph. Yeah, the number is great. The top line, this is how much we can pull from here. But what I like to be able to say is, okay, I get that there's urban densities in Kamal, Pflugerville, Georgetown, very urban places now. We're not urban yet. But in that scenario, does the taxable value equate to something that is equal to the amount of students that we are serving? And then that also
I
then
think we're
turns
gonna get
into
to that, because
the
I have
demographic. Yeah.
I have some by students, so y'all just bear with me. You're trying to be advanced students. All right, so this is by student. So here's taxable assessed value per student. Do you want to come here? Come help me. You got this. I need a co-presenter. All right, so this is Texas. So per student, Barbers Hill, Lake Travis, then us. Central Texas, kind of the same thing. Eames, this is what I want to point out. Eames is taxable value per student. This is I can't read these numbers. Almost
It literally should just be pulled off. Because
It is
such an
so-
overstatement.
So when people say, well, how come Eames has a 12-cent tax rate? This.
Because there's
is
$2.4
why.
million homes at the minimum.
Yes. Then Lake Travis, Georgetown, then us. So is it coming together now? All right, so now let's look at debt outstanding, okay? So do we have a lot more debt than these other districts? So here's our debt. This is as of, and I'm saying as of March 1 because next week I'm making a debt payment, so I'm taking the liberty to take that out because it's going away. I think we probably already sent the money. These are what we have outstanding on bonds. So we have a 2012 refunding, 1.4 million left. I think it pays off in August. Last August, we paid off this 13 refunding. We have a 2014 refunding that's almost gone, and then bonds from the 2018, and then a refunding in 2020. So in total, we owe $385 million. Each year, we have to pay about $20 million towards this debt, and that is coming from the IMS tax rate.
I'm sorry if I missed it. Did you explain refunding as opposed?
So that's a refinancing. So
Oh,
if I sold bonds years ago and I can refinance them at a lower rate, it turns into a refunding. Oh, hands everywhere.
What
Dan?
happened in 2018 to where the principal and the interest are only 17% different?
So the history on these real quick, the 2012 had an interest rate around 5%, it's refinanced down to 2.3. And so what's remaining, and the next slide we'll get into that. The 2012, 2013, 13's paid off, 12's about to be paid off. Because what happens is some of your old bonds, when they were voted and approved, are sold at a certain rate. Just like when you refinance a mortgage, you're allowed to refinance on tax exempt basis one time before the debt can be paid off anyway. So what happens is you refinance new debt or old debt with refunding bonds. That's when it says refunding. The 2018 has not been refinanced. That is that voter-approved debt that was issued in 2018 and sits out there for 20, 25 years. So the interest component's higher. Just like on a mortgage, the interest component winds up being almost as much as the home itself.
Are we?
Yeah, but
Paying the interest now, principal now, though?
So let me go to the next slide, maybe this will
Okay.
help. All right, so these are all of our bonds that are currently outstanding. They're called series because that's the year that that transaction happened. So don't get lost in that. Here's that 2012. So that 1.4 million is paying off. So the bars are going to show when it is paying, what is paid, and when it's paid off. 2014, you can see about 8 million this year, under 7.5, then a $5 million payment on it for 2 years, then it goes away. 2018, we have some that's paid here, but then it is level debt service back here. So remember, when we issue bonds, we are trying to keep our payment at something we can afford. We're not going to go sell bonds and have a $70 million payment when our tax collections don't support $70 million. So when we structure this debt, it is laid out where we can afford it.
It's also, it typically goes out 30 years because the facilities have a useful life. Now, if there's a component that's a mechanical piece or buses or some short term, you're paying principal immediately from the beginning of the debt. So there is never carrying an asset that's funded through a bond for 30 years if its useful life technology is 7 to 10 years. We make sure to amortize that in those pieces.
You might be about to say it, so sorry here, but on that previous slide for 2018 building, the principal and interest, they're pretty similar. And then I think it was for 2020, the principal and interest, there was a big change, big delta there.
Yeah.
What were different in those two?
The 2020 was a refunding, and so that was being able to.
Or 2019, I'm sorry. Do you see the difference?
2019 was a very small, that was the balance of the authorization from 2018.
So,
The percentage is similar, right?
yeah, well, it's,
No.
No, you're right.
No, yeah.
I think it's yellow, and keep
Okay.
going.
All right, so then the 2019, remember it was about 20 million, so this is when it pays.
it's shorter because it's smaller amount, we have more capacity. Probably didn't take it out as long and also paid off more principal more quickly.
Gotcha.
And then finally, the 2020 refunding. So you can see, this is our annual, this is our total debt, so just under 20 million, just over 20 million. It takes a dip here, so that gives us the capacity to pay off future bonds in the shorter term. We can get lower interest rates in the shorter term. So we would probably fill in that hole in a new structure. Then we're at that 20 mark until, vision is bad, 2034. Nothing pays off. We're not completely out of debt until 2048. And so you've got longer interest payments on that green because it's structured out longer.
And the stair step down in 25 and 26 is intentional, knowing there's probably a need for other facilities. Because if we just made it level, you would just have to kick up even more to carry that new debt on. So what the district has been doing, and my number since 2012, those refinancings or just paying debt off early. So let's say an election doesn't pass, doesn't come about, instead of just having the tax rate drop from 35 cents to whatever, and then have to come back and ask for more pennies. The structure is to just pay some of this other debt off early in anticipation. Now, if you were built out, never had needed another facility or a means, then you might get more aggressive. But this is the prudent structure to the last thing people want is 35-cent debt rate this year, 30 next year, and ask for 38 2 years later, because then the criticisms, didn't you
Yeah,
know?
so
it's
to your
coming?
point, Tony, if we weren't gonna issue any more debt, these 2 years, I would probably lower that 35 cents, but then the next year, I'm gonna have to jack it back up because my payment goes up.
This entire graph is without this new.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Because we haven't sold, we don't know how to do that.
So 35 cents is the $20 million number. You can run a red line right across that and say that is where we cap, that's our high water mark.
And so in this year, if the 35 cents brings in 21 million, 22 million, I'm gonna use that to pay off some of this
You're
early through other
accelerating all the debt
fees.
across that. So if I open the.
So I don't get to just keep that money. By law, I have to use it to pay off debt.
Please
So
do.
I make 13 mortgage payments instead of 12.
Yeah. So if we overlay the new bond, we're gonna be shifting the blue line a little bit thinner, and then we're gonna be
Well, we're gonna
overlaying
be
whatever
stacking, we're gonna
2023,
stack
you're
on
gonna
top.
stack into that,
We're gonna
and
stack
then
some
shift
here,
that.
we're gonna
Yeah.
stack some here, we're gonna stack some here.
27 to 32 is going to go above that
You
line?
know, good.
Because we'll have bonds paid off.
We'll pay off the, remember these lines here are going away. This one's going away, so this line will come down. And as those, we're trying to keep 35 cents where it doesn't have to go up.
And 35 cents is producing more than what the bars show with the anticipation for additional debt. If you didn't have anticipation, if you weren't a growth area, you wouldn't hold that rate. And I think one thing, when you look at that prior slide where it had the outstanding issues of 385 million, I think it was, principal and interest, this is, I think, the healthy part of this conversation is that proposition language that says this will be a property tax increase. It's very confusing because you've already seen now valuation impacts, what your tax rate is, and what is needed to support the debt. The one thing I would just suggest is when that language was put in the proposition, it's confusing because what the district controls is a tax rate and what debt the voters approve. And having that language there highlights that it makes it sound like there's a tax rate increase. Over
There's a
time,
tax increase. We all understand that,
Yeah.
that the tax rate stays the same.
but
There's
there's
a place
these,
that is an actual tax increase, the number of dollars that we have to pay on our tax bill.
and the years are going to be extended. So it's a property tax increase over time. But the one thing they can manage, it's like if you're buying another house, you know you're buying another house. There's more debt coming with that. And that's all, I think, the confusion sometimes comes from property tax and property tax rate.
It's very clear in my mind, but just, again, the messaging that comes out of the district and all the pamphlets and everything, and all the discussions I see online, you know, there just seems to be this persistent insinuation that you will not have the tax bill go up. And that needs to be made very clear to the taxpayers, your tax bill will go up. The rate stays the same, your tax bill will go up.
Good question.
Only because their property values are going up. But that has nothing to do with the school, I mean, that's not the school district's issue.
Right, the school district is doing all they can to keep it as low as
Just
they
because
can.
there's
We
a
can debate
windfall
this
because
for
of that
10
one.
hours and we're never gonna agree. I've got 10 more slides. I'm gonna take this question, we're gonna move on.
With the existing climate with interest rates and whatnot, new bonds, interest rates are going to be much higher. Why would we pay off the much lower interest rate bonds at this point?
So that's a great question. When you sell a 30-year bond, you know, the 2025 maturity versus the 2048 and beyond are different interest rates. So when the district pays off existing debt, they literally pick which are either higher interest rates or supports the structure. The new bonds, and again, remember the INS debt tax rate is collected, has to go to debt. So what I can tell you is if we issued new bonds next year, and those are the higher interest coupons, we could pay some of that new debt down. So we look at it year by year. It's not one, we don't just, we've got all these slated candidates, and if there's a new issue passed, that'll be part of the candidate pool to choose from as well. And you're right, we've sold at extremely low interest rates. So if the new debt is higher, we may cherry pick some of those.
All right, I'm going to move on. All right, so this is just a picture of the previous slide that was not supposed to be in here. So the other thing I want to address is debt service fund balance. So we get accused of having too much fund balance in debt service. Last July 1, we had 18.9 million. What you don't understand, July 1 is our fiscal year end. It stops. We have a debt payment in August of 6.3 million. When do people pay taxes?
Yeah, from January.
Well, monthly through your mortgage. When do I get the money? January, December. So I'm not getting money in July to make this debt payment. I better have money in the bank in August to make this payment. So that's why I need fund balance. So in August, we paid 6.3, so that balance went down to 12 million. Then I get revenue, so through December, we collected 19 million. I have a February payment of 13 million. So you see this is a flow. Money comes in, money goes out. I'm projecting at the end of June, I'll have 18.83, very close to what I had here. Guess what happens in August? I have another debt payment. I've got to have the money in the bank. So I have another debt payment of 6.4 in August. That leaves my balance at 12 million. Could I spend some of this 12 million to pay off additional debt? Yes. What happens if for some reason people don't pay their taxes or values decline? I potentially have to raise that 35 cents to pay my existing. So maintaining a fund balance here is important, one, so that I can make my debt payments, and two, to be able to prepare for value loss or people don't pay their taxes.
And one other, in 2020, the district contributed 5 million of that debt service fund. You know, you monitor as it grows and put it into the refunding at that point, paid some debt off early. So it's just that, monitoring.
So it's, what is the sweet spot? Do we want 3 million? Absolutely not. That would make me nervous. Do I want 8 million? I don't know. That's a conversation. 12 million is very comfortable. It's not too much. It makes sure that we make our debt payments. There's one thing that makes me lose sleep at night. Did we make our debt payment? I don't want to go to jail. All right, here is some other rankings. I think I have 10 of these left, so I'm going to go through these real fast. This is bond principal outstanding. So of that same comparison group, how does our debt compare to other districts? So across the state, you can see we're at the bottom of the grouping. Central Texas, same thing. Bond principal outstanding as a percentage of taxable value. Why is that important? We're relying on that taxable value to generate the revenues that we need to pay that debt. Very good shape as far as bonds outstanding related to principal or taxable value. Same in the Central Texas area. How much bond debt do we have per student? Someone asked about that. Statewide comparison, below half, right around half in the Central Texas area.
But how does that change with this new bond issue if it passes?
Well, I don't know what that new bond issue is going to be. And so, this is 21-22 data, Tony, so we haven't built in new. And at the same time, these other districts are potentially issuing more debt as well. Here's the tax rate. So the interest in seeking tax rate across the state, look how many districts are at that 50-cent max. We're down here at 35. This is 22-23. I was able to get this updated yesterday. In our area, we've got one at 50 cents, 48, 47. We're right in about the middle of everybody in our tax rate. Again, Eanes over here at 12 cents, they're not growing, and they have values that are almost triple ours. So, as a summary, We issue debt to finance large capital expenditures. We have to ask the voters to approve issuing bonds before we just go out and issue debt. We then levy a tax rate to support those bonds. We, as a fast-growth district, face the challenge of additional students in a quicker time frame. And when you look at our debt picture compared across the state and in our area, we look pretty favorable. Just want to remind you before you rush out of here that our next meeting is March 7th at Sycamore Middle School, where we get to talk about my third favorite subject, recapture, and its impact on the district. And maybe by then we'll have a little bit more about bills that have been filed and if they're being steam or not. Thank y'all so much for coming and being participatory. I know you probably have 1,000 other questions. You can ask Holly or Dan.
And you're welcome